Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. First, I would like to thank the leadership of the Research Center for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons at Nagasaki University and PCU-Nagasaki Council. PCU-Nagasaki Council and the Atomic Bomb Museum for the opportunity to speak with you today. Okay, but before I begin, I think it would be useful to say some things about myself and about the organization where I work. That's me in 1957, which is the year that I was born. And that was the same year that Sputnik started the space race, and the same year that the US Department of Agriculture started the public spraying of DDT, which led to Rachel Carson's book called The Silent Spring. So I grew up under the shadow of the threat of nuclear war and the threat of catastrophic environmental contamination and disruption. On the very first Earth Day in 1970, my 7th grade science teacher, who was a Catholic nun, told me that the fate of human civilization rested with choices I would make, my generation would make, about nuclear war and about environmental collapse. And of course, that was quite a lot of responsibility to put on the shoulders of a 13-year-old. The Union of Concerned Scientists was founded about a year earlier, in 1969. The concerned scientist who started the union had the same warning about the same two threats as my 7th grade science teacher. That's her there. But whereas the Catholic nun told me it was my responsibility to fix these problems, the Union of Concerned Scientists said that scientists had a special responsibility because the scientific community was uniquely responsible for stopping the effect of these destructive technologies that were operating without public knowledge and beyond public control. They decided to work within the government, with the government. They were not protesters in the streets. And they did that despite very serious reservations they had about the way science was being used to fight the war in Vietnam. I studied political science and international relations in college. But I felt it was being used to manipulate people and control people. And part of the reason I felt that way is because I discovered when I graduated that the only people who would offer me jobs were the National Security Agency, where my father worked, or the Central Intelligence Agency, or any of these other military agencies of the US government. Luckily for me, there was a Chinese-American professor, Dr. Kong, pictured with the children there, and he established an exchange program with Fudan University in Shanghai, and I was the first one that they picked to send in 1984. And I ended up staying there. I got married there. Our son was born there. And I worked in China for 10 years doing educational exchanges between the United States and China, mostly American students coming to China, and I would take care of them when they were in China, and run the programs that they were in. In 2000, we left China to come back to the United States. I came back, my wife and son came with me. And in 2002, I started working for the Union of Concerned Scientists. And my job was the same, except I was doing it with different people. Chinese nuclear weapons labs, American nuclear weapons labs, doing exchanges to talk about nuclear arms control. Now, my organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, is not a think tank. It's not a research organization. We do research. That's not what we do. We lobby the government. We take positions on public policy. We have opinions, we have ideas, and we want those ideas to become law. And so we work in Washington to try to do that. Because we do that, because we participate in government, lobby the government, we don't accept any money from corporations, no money from governments, no money from corporations, or no money from foreign sources of any kind. We have 100,000, actually 120,000 members who contribute money to our organization. $40 million worth of money in the last year. And most of that comes from small donations, but we have some very rich people who give us a lot of money too. And some foundations give us support. UCS, or the Union of Concerned Scientists, has about 300 people working in 4 offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Washington, in Chicago, and in Oakland. And we have 7 separate programs, and if you're interested, I can talk about them all afterwards. We spend 88% of the money we get on the programs, which has earned us very high ratings from charitable evaluators in the United States, which is why people feel safe contributing their money to our organization. So now that I've told you something about me and my organization, we can start our talk about the question for today, which is the future, present, past of tactical nuclear weapons in Asia. Now, as you may know, the Japanese government has asked the United States to defend Japan with US nuclear weapons. And the United States has agreed to provide that protection. And some people call this the nuclear umbrella. Today, this nuclear umbrella over Japan is provided by ballistic missile submarines, like the one in this picture. In the picture, this is the USS Louisiana. It was the last of a current generation of what they call Ohio-class submarines. Very big submarines. There are 14 of them, and 10 of them are at sea all the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, all the time. 6 of those submarines are constantly on patrol in the Pacific Ocean. And they can launch their nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in minutes. Maybe 20, maybe 25 minutes. Each of those submarines carries 24 of these Trident D5 ballistic missiles, pictured here. And each one of those missiles can carry up to 14 nuclear warheads. Now, until very recently, all of those missiles on those submarines that provide this nuclear umbrella were armed with what are called strategic nuclear weapons. But just this year, with the support of the Japanese government, President Trump started converting some of those missiles and some of those warheads to tactical nuclear weapons. Now, it's hard to find a consistent definition of the difference between strategic and tactical, but there are some clear differences between the two, which are evident in this change, this conversion that President Trump is doing with the Japanese government's support. Right? The purpose of the change is to make the yield, which is just the size of the explosion, smaller. And the way they're doing that is to take part of the warhead out, as you can see in the two pictures. The new tactical warhead pictured on the right is supposedly designed for fighting limited nuclear wars, small nuclear wars. Strategic weapons are for a major nuclear war between nuclear-armed countries. Now, every president writes something called a nuclear posture review. It's just a document where a president decides, this is how many nuclear weapons I need, and this is what I want to do with them. President Trump decided he needed new, low-yield, tactical nuclear weapons to fight a future war with China. And the US military's advisors he selected to write this report said that the United States can't win a war with China without these weapons. That we would lose if we just used non-nuclear weapons. So they need these new low-yield nuclear weapons to fight this future war with China. The Japanese government agreed with President Trump and encouraged them to build these new low-yield nuclear weapons. So what that means is that the Japanese government supports the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Asia. Today, what they call tactical nuclear weapons, or small nuclear weapons, are about the same size as the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that means that the current government of Japan supports allowing people in Chinese cities to suffer the same consequences as the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a future war between the United States and China. There are 4 new types of tactical nuclear weapons that they want to put back in Asia. One we already talked about, this changing of the submarine warhead. Another one is the B-61-12, which is a bomb dropped from an airplane. And there's also something called the LRSO, which is a missile dropped from an airplane, a cruise missile, that can guide its way to a target far away. And the last kind is a new submarine-launched cruise missile to replace an old one. The picture here is actually of an old submarine-launched cruise missile, because they haven't designed the new one yet. They just started working on it. Now, if you could ask the US and Japanese officials who have been pushing Mr. Abe and Mr. Trump to do this, to support the development and deployment of these new tactical nuclear weapons, and if those officials gave you an honest answer, the same answer they give to each other in private, behind closed doors, they would tell you that the US-Japan alliance needs to threaten to use these new tactical nuclear weapons against China. But they hope they would never really have to use them. And they would say they believe that because they believe if they threaten China with these low-yield weapons, then China will back down and do what they want them to do. China won't start a war, or if they do start a war, they won't prosecute the war to the end. Now, if you ask them, well, why can't you use strategic nuclear weapons, the ones you already have, to do the same thing? And they would tell you that strategic nuclear weapons are too big. So if they threaten to use them, China wouldn't believe them. But if they have small nuclear weapons, then the Chinese will believe they actually use them. This is the way they think. So they believe that if they threaten to use low-yield nuclear weapons, China will quit. But if China doesn't quit, and they actually use these weapons, if they have to use them, that China will not retaliate with nuclear weapons. So even if we get in a war and we have to use these weapons, China will not use its nuclear weapons in retaliation. Now, why do they believe that? These numbers are what they would point to tell you why China would not retaliate. The most important number is the last one. China doesn't have low-yield nuclear weapons. All of China's nuclear weapons are really big, city-destroying, 10 times larger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Megatons. 400 kilotons is their smallest weapon. And the United States believed China would never risk retaliating with such a big nuclear weapon for fear of starting a nuclear war with Japan and the United States, because they would lose that war, because Japan and the United States have so many more strategic nuclear weapons, 3,800 of them, to China, which only has 290. So this is what they believe. They believe that China will back down if we threaten to use weapons. If we do use weapons, China won't retaliate because they know they would lose. This is what they think the Chinese think. But that's not what the Chinese think at all. They're wrong, right? Ever since China first exploded its nuclear weapon, China made a promise to the world that they would never use them first, right? Under any circumstances, at any time. They would only use their nuclear weapons to retaliate. In that same statement, which is the only statement China has ever made about why it built nuclear weapons and why it has nuclear weapons. It's the only time they've ever said anything publicly, right? What purpose they serve. China's repeated this belief that they say that nuclear weapons are a paper tiger. Something that looks scary, but is not scary. Something that's meant to threaten you, but something you can't use. You can't use nuclear weapons. They're too horrible. They're too awful. They're too destructive. It's not a weapon you can use in a real war. And in that same statement, they explained, well, why do we want them then? Why do we have them? If you can't use them in a war. They don't want to be blackmailed. They don't want to be threatened with nuclear weapons. And they believe if they know that you know that they can retaliate, then they can ignore your threats. You can threaten to use nuclear weapons all you want. I won't believe you because you won't want me to retaliate. Even with one, you won't want it. And they call this nuclear blackmail. They're protecting themselves from nuclear blackmail. This is the way they talk about nuclear weapons. This is what the Chinese think about nuclear weapons. And they believe, Chinese leaders believed then and they believe today that if China had just enough nuclear weapons to be sure that they could retaliate, that was enough. That's all they need. They don't need many. That's enough to stop the United States from threatening China. Or even if the United States threatens China, we don't need to believe it. Now, are the Chinese telling the truth, or are they lying? That's a very important question. If you look at the numbers, I think they're telling the truth. China's very rich now. It's very technologically sophisticated. If they wanted to have as many nuclear weapons as the United States, they could, but they don't. If they wanted to have low-yield nuclear weapons, they could. But as far as we know, they don't. So I think there's reason to believe they're telling the truth. Now, it doesn't take an expert in cross-cultural communication to realize there's a mismatch here. The Japanese and the Chinese, the Americans think the Chinese think one way, and the Chinese think something different. That could be very dangerous if there's a real war. Because Trump and Abe believe that China will back down if you threaten them with low-yield nuclear weapons. The Chinese believe nuclear weapons are paper tigers, so I don't need to care about your threats. Trump and Abe believe, okay, well, if I use them, you won't retaliate. In an actual war, this could prove to be very dangerous, and there could be accidental start of exchange of nuclear weapons. I would have thought the leader of Japan would think about nuclear weapons, and his advisors would think about nuclear weapons differently, and I don't know why Japan supports this kind of policy. So I don't really feel, I don't speak Japanese, I don't know anything about Japanese history or culture. So I'm not qualified to talk about what Japan thinks about this. That's for you and your government. But I do know my own country, and they're thinking about nuclear weapons, and I have some familiarity with China's history, culture, language, and the way they think about nuclear weapons. And the historical relationship between China and the United States. So for the second part of my talk today, I want to talk about that history, because I think it has some lessons for what might happen if there's threats to use nuclear weapons in the future, in a future war. The United States tried to threaten China before. This isn't a new idea with tactical nuclear weapons. this kind of thinking in the United States goes back to the 1950s, at the beginning of the US experience with nuclear weapons, at the end of World War II, and the revolution that put the Chinese communists in power that happened just 4 years after the end of World War II. Americans, whether it's true or not, believe that nuclear weapons ended World War II. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war. And so they think it ended the war, and that was the best way to end the war, because it ended the war fast, quick, it was over. So Americans have a positive view of nuclear weapons. That's part of the way we think about these weapons. Whether it's true or not, this is what Americans believe, that nuclear weapons can stop wars and nuclear weapons can prevent wars. And this belief guides our policy. And it started in the 1950s, when we started to develop nuclear weapons. In the 50s, all these countries in the world were asking the United States for help. Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Turkey, Greece, countries in Europe. And the United States was very rich, and the United States was very powerful, but we just didn't have enough to give all these countries. Nuclear weapons were the answer. They believed if they had these small nuclear weapons they could use in all these wars, that would be cheaper and easier. And this is the way we started to think about deploying these low-yield nuclear weapons everywhere. And that policy continued for a long time. In Japan, the first time they did this, they talked to your self-defense forces about using nuclear weapons to defend Japan, was in 1957. And they had an exercise. And they pretended that the Soviet bombers were coming to bomb Japan. And they were going to fire nuclear artillery shells in the air and blow them up in the air to destroy the Soviet airplanes. And they told and practiced this with your defense force. And your defense force was like, what do you want to do? You want to blow up tens of nuclear weapons in the sky over top of Japan? This is your plan? And they started asking questions to their American counterparts. And this is when your government became interested in the question of using nuclear weapons to defend Japan in 1957. They started after that to deploy all kinds of these weapons in Asia. You can see the numbers here, thousands, up to 10,000 almost at one point. This is the number that were of all the weapons deployed at sea. This is 1961 at the beginning, 77 at the end. And this is the ones they deployed on shore. You can see they had them in Okinawa, and Korea, and Guam, and Taiwan, and the Philippines. They had these small nuclear weapons everywhere. So the Japanese government started to ask the Americans, can we have them for our own? Would you mind if Japan had its own nuclear weapons? And the US military said, sure, no problem. Nuclear weapons are like any other weapon. If Japan wants to have them, we agree. But political leaders thought about this differently. Right? They were less certain that there was no difference between nuclear and conventional weapons when they came to using them in warfare. But they both believed that if they could threaten to use nuclear weapons, that would keep the peace. And our governments have believed this ever since then. And they keep generating generation after generation of officials who believed this same thing, that if you can threaten to use these small nuclear weapons, we can keep the peace. This is why we can't abolish nuclear weapons. Because governments like yours and governments like ours believe they keep the peace. This is the hardest thing. We have to change their minds. There have been some US presidents who disagreed and who tried to change things. The most important one is this man here, George H.W. Bush. He took all of those tactical nuclear weapons in Asia and brought them home and destroyed them. And there was no treaty. He did this by himself, very fast. And he took most of the tactical nuclear weapons out of Europe. And the US military never liked that decision. They've been complaining about it ever since. President Obama tried to make that policy official, sort of, by saying the United States would never use, he wanted to say the United States would only use nuclear weapons to retaliate, just like the Chinese. That's the only purpose, is if you use them first, we'll retaliate. But your government, the Japanese government, Obama was going to say this when he came to Hiroshima. Your government lobbied the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Energy to tell President Obama not to say that in Japan. Because they still believe you need these small nuclear weapons to fight a future war with China. And with Trump, now they're actually starting to build these things for warfighting in Asia. And we're going to take a look at that. But before we do, it's important to look at the whole history. Why is the United States so afraid of China? I want to talk about that for a little bit. And the second thing is how this fear of China affected US thinking and US government. And the third is how this led the United States to threaten China with nuclear weapons. Because we did it before, twice. We threatened to use nuclear weapons during the Korean War, and we threatened to use nuclear weapons in the Taiwan Straits crisis in the 1950s. Americans feel like they lost China to communism, like it was ours and we lost it. They actually asked this question, who lost China? And Americans started blaming each other. And it created a kind of craziness in American politics about China, a kind of hysteria. And you can see that in this advertisement from Life magazine in the 1950s. This was put there by something called the John Birch Society. Now, this society was the beginning of the right-wing groups in America who put President Trump in the White House. The same family. One of the biggest funders of the John Birch Society was a man named Fred Koch. His two sons, Charles and David Koch, are the ones who funded the right-wing groups that put President Trump in the White House. Same family who put that ad in the Times, in the Life magazine. So many of these negative characterizations of China today are the same as the negative characterizations from the 1950s, and they're promoted by the same people. And I worry that if these people have too much influence, we could have a war. We could really have a war between the United States and China. And if there is such a war, these people might use nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons, to fight that war. So it's something we need to pay attention to. But we did this before, and it didn't work. The United States military became worried about China after a battle everyone's forgotten in Hainan Island, this island pictured here, in March of 1950. They thought that the Chinese beat 120,000 nationalist troops with superior Air Force and Navy and equipment in 6 weeks. And the US military was worried they were going to go into Vietnam. This is 1950. And it was 1 week after that battle, we know from the Pentagon Papers now, that Truman decided to support the French, and that was the first step the United States took into the Vietnam War because of this battle. So the public is scared of China, now the military is also scared of China in the United States. How scared? So scared that they started blaming different Americans for being too nice to China, including General Marshall. They called General Marshall of the Marshall Plan a communist. They called all the people who worked for General Marshall in the State Department and in the Defense Department communists because he tried to negotiate peace between the nationalists and the communists right after the end of World War II in 1945. And they blamed him for the communists winning, for America losing China. Marshall lost to China. The people who did that, this is Senator McCarthy, was one of the most important. His lawyer was a name named Roy Cohn. He was the one who gathered this evidence that all these people were communists. It was all fake, a lot of it. Fake news in the 1950s. This lawyer became a personal political advisor for many decades to Donald Trump. That's the two of them sitting together when you can see President Trump as a much younger man. So it's the same people. This is responsible for this craziness about China and America, the trade war, and the want to use these nuclear weapons. It comes from the same group of people. Now, the first time they tried to threaten China with nuclear weapons was in Korea. Kim decided to invade the South to try to unify Korea. And they saw what was happening in Hainan Island. And they were worried they were in an all-out war with communism in Asia. Truman believed this. And they thought all the communists were acting together. Koreans, the Chinese, and the Soviets, all thinking and acting the same. One thing I learned through this study that I'm talking about today is it's not true. They argued with each other. They didn't agree. Mao did not want Kim to invade South Korea. He told him, we know from archives, he told him not to do it. He disagreed with it. He said, you'll lose. The Americans will come in. And then the Americans will be on China's border. So don't do this. But Stalin and Kim did it anyway. So China was not part of that decision. And Mao was exactly right. The Americans came in, and MacArthur started pushing armies towards the border with China. And he was talking about using nuclear weapons to bomb Chinese cities because China was supporting North Korea. This is before China entered the war. So everything that Mao believed would happen if Kim invaded South Korea happened. Chinese generals argued among themselves about, well, what do we do? Some were worried the United States was going to use nuclear weapons against China. And they said, we can't get in a fight with America, they'll destroy us. They'll bomb Shanghai, they'll bomb Beijing. We'll be destroyed. Chinese generals were worried about attacks that would completely destroy their country. And some were so worried, they said, if China keeps being involved in the Korean War, I'm not fighting. General Lin Biao, who was a hero of the battles in the Civil War in Manchuria, walked out of the room, told Mao he's not going to command troops, I'm not going to fight. My father-in-law was one of the Chinese troops who was on the border in Manchuria at this time, and they were scared the United States would use nuclear weapons. And the troops were running away and going home. They were afraid that the United States would use these weapons and they would all be killed. So MacArthur wasn't wrong in thinking that these threats would affect the Chinese. The problem was so serious that the Chinese political officers in Manchuria told this to the generals in Beijing as they were arguing. Mao said, don't worry. No problem. The United States is not going to use nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are a paper tiger. He had said this before, right after Hiroshima, to this journalist, American journalist, Anna Louise Strong. And he said it again in this meeting with the generals. Don't worry. They can't use nuclear weapons. You can't fight a war with nuclear weapons. Why? If you use them on the battlefield, you'll kill your own people. And if you use them to bomb Chinese cities, the rest of the world will condemn the United States. So it's a paper tiger. They're bluffing. They won't use these weapons. Don't worry. Peng Dehuai, another strong Chinese general, agreed with Mao. They persuaded the rest of the Chinese generals, and they went into Korea and pushed the United States back to the 38th parallel in Korea. And they were able to do that because Mao's argument also convinced people like my father-in-law. It gave them the confidence to go, to fight. They stopped running away. They believed nuclear weapons were a paper tiger, that the United States would not use them. This is the origins of Chinese thinking about nuclear weapons, this paper tiger theory. And it's become the foundation of Chinese nuclear weapons policy even today. After the Chinese came in, Truman threatened in newspapers to use nuclear weapons against China. It was published all over the world. But we never used them. It was a paper tiger. Mao was right. Eisenhower, the general, World War II, gets elected in 1952 while the war is still being fought because he's promising to end it. Today, people believe that it's because Eisenhower threatened to use nuclear weapons. That's why the Chinese gave up and signed an armistice. But that's false. It's not true. Eisenhower didn't do that. This was a myth that was created by his Secretary of State, Dulles. This is an article, an interview with Dulles from, I think it's also from Life magazine, where he says, this is later in 1957, We threatened to use nuclear weapons, and that's why the Chinese signed the armistice in Korea. And this became believed by academics, and it became believed by newspaper reporters, and it became the belief of ordinary people, and it's still the belief of most American experts to this day that it was our threats to use nuclear weapons that ended the Korean War. But we know that's not true. It's not true, it's false. Eisenhower looked at North Korea, there was nothing left to bomb. We had already destroyed everything. The US strategic bombing campaign against North Korea was even worse than the firebombing of Japanese cities during World War II. More bombs in less space in a quicker time. It was horrible. And even then, the Chinese would not give up. They would not give up. Kim, the Korean leader, he wanted to quit. Mao said, nope, we can't quit while they're still bombing. The bombing lengthened the war. It didn't shorten the war because of the way Mao thought. And this is what he told. We know this now. We have the cable from Mao to Kim. Mao said, if you do this, if you accept these terms from the US under these present circumstances while they're still bombing, that will make Americans stronger and us weaker. So we can't quit now. He told Kim that in 1952. The war didn't end for another year. One thing Eisenhower did do was he threatened to let the nationalists start attacking China. And this is the second part of the story. And Eisenhower figured that this would put pressure on China to stop the war. And it was all about these tiny islands of Quemoy and Matsu. Some of you here may remember this. Chiang Kai-shek had put all his best troops on these tiny islands close to China. And he did that to give confidence to the Chinese who fled with him to Taiwan that they would be able to come back soon, because we were ready to invade the mainland and overthrow the communists. So Eisenhower was afraid if the Chinese communists took these tiny islands, Chiang Kai-shek's government would collapse and they would lose Taiwan. And Eisenhower was ready to use US nuclear weapons to save these tiny islands of Quemoy and Matsu. This is true. He was ready to bomb China. And where was he going to bomb? All these things that you see, the artillery guns there, the airplane bases on this map. I never knew the details until I started to study. But this man, Thomas Schelling, who's probably the most famous nuclear strategist in the US he won a Nobel Prize for bargaining in economics. He told the CTBTO, the organization that governs the Test Ban Treaty, that the threat of nuclear war was greater during this crisis in Taiwan than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a bigger chance of a nuclear war because of this Taiwan crisis, than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was shocked when I heard that. So at the time of this interview, my organization was looking at this low-yield nuclear weapons problem. And so we thought there might be lessons in this Taiwan Straits history for this strategy of deploying low-yield nuclear weapons that we could learn from for today. And so the next thing I'm going to talk about is how this strategy developed because of this Taiwan Straits crisis. First of all, the one thing we learned is that the United States' threats to use nuclear weapons in the Taiwan crisis also failed. They did not affect the Chinese thinking. China didn't care. They didn't believe it. And even if the United States did it, they were still going to keep fighting anyway. And another thing we learned is that this strategy of limited nuclear war, this is when it started. It started from this crisis in Taiwan. All of the theories and ideas about how to fight a limited nuclear war started here. So these are the places that they wanted to bomb, and they were going to use these airdropped bombs. And they had an aircraft carrier sitting in the Taiwan Straits, and the planes were loaded with these weapons, and they were ready. They were going to do it. There was a lot of pressure from the military to do this now, because if we wait, China will have too many airplanes, and we won't be able to win. Eisenhower wanted to avoid this. He wanted Chiang Kai-shek to take those soldiers and bring them back to Taiwan. Let China have these stupid small islands. And he sent the General Radford of the Joint Chief of Staff to Taiwan to try to convince Chiang Kai-shek to do that. But General Radford was one of these right-wing supporters of using nuclear weapons against China. He wanted to launch a whole-out nuclear war against China and help Chiang Kai-shek, who was his friend, reconquer the mainland. But Radford was a good military man, and he kept this to himself. And he did what Eisenhower asked him to do. And he went to China to try to get to Chiang Kai-shek to try to get him to move the troops off the island. But Chiang Kai-shek knew what he thought. And so Chiang Kai-shek said no. He kept his troops there. And so Eisenhower thought he didn't have a choice. He was going to have to use nuclear weapons to defend those islands. So he had his Secretary of State and Vice President Nixon make announcements in speeches. We're going to do it. We're going to attack China with nuclear weapons. And this is in March of 1955. Dulles, remembering the paper tiger remark from Mao, warned in his speech, the United States is not a paper tiger. He was talking right to Mao, saying, your paper tiger theory is false. We will use these weapons to attack you. So it was a serious threat. We are all very lucky because there was a conference scheduled in April in Bandung in Indonesia. And it was the first conference that China was invited, that communists were invited to represent China. And Eisenhower and Dulles decided to wait because they didn't think that China would attack these islands until after the conference. And we're all very lucky that things happened this way. Because at that conference, Zhou Enlai offered to talk to the United States. This, by the way, was China's strategy all along. They were threatening those islands because they wanted to force the United States to talk to them. This is what they wanted, negotiations. It's just like the North Koreans today. And they got the negotiations. The United States agreed to talk. Now this ended the threat of nuclear war. It ended right there with this statement by Zhou Enlai. Everybody relaxed. The crisis was over. In the United States, we think of what happened in this period as two crises, because China's going to start threatening the islands again a few years later, in 1958. But in 1954 and 55, it ended with Zhou Enlai's offer to talk. And we think of these as two separate things in the United States, but it's not. It's one thing. Because there were negotiations in the middle. And those negotiations are really very important to remember. These are the two US and Chinese officials who were doing the negotiating. The negotiations didn't lead to anything. But the negotiations stopped a nuclear war. That's pretty good. So even though they couldn't agree on anything, they talked for years and things quieted down. Why didn't the negotiations succeed? Because this article got published in the middle of those negotiations. When Dulles was saying, falsely, that China surrendered in Korea because they threatened to use nuclear weapons. And the Chinese were furious. And the talks break down. And the Chinese start bombing the small islands again. This is what they call the second crisis, but really it's the same crisis. It's one thing. And we know this from archives. We have the historical documents now, Soviet and Chinese archives. And what they prove is that the United States completely misunderstood the Chinese. They didn't know what they wanted. They didn't know what they were thinking. They didn't know how they would respond. They were never going to invade Taiwan. It's impossible. They didn't have a navy. They didn't have an air force. We know this from the documents. They were asking the Soviet Union for help. They also show something very interesting. China was willing to be attacked with nuclear weapons, with these small nuclear weapons. Go ahead. Do it. We dare you. We're still not going to quit. The documents show that. You destroy these airfields, so what? We'll rebuild them. So they were not intimidated. They were not scared. Well, they were probably scared. But they were not going to give in. They were not going to back down like Abe and Trump think they will. They were happy to make the United States think the Soviet Union would retaliate for China. But when the Soviets asked them, do you want us, if the United States attacks China with nuclear weapons, do you want us to retaliate? The Chinese said no. We don't need your help. We don't want your help. We're not going to drag the Soviet Union into a nuclear war with America. We'll take it. We'll suffer it. We'll deal with it. This is what they told the Soviets. It was Khrushchev who said, no, if they attack China, China's our friend. If we don't attack America, then we look weak. The Soviets look weak. And so Khrushchev writes 2 letters to Eisenhower saying, if you attack China, we'll attack you. This is in 1957-58. And we know this from the archives. When Khrushchev did that, he didn't know that they were going to start shelling these islands again. So the Chinese were lying to the Soviets a little bit, and they were posturing with the Americans, and this is what led to the breakdown in relations between the Soviet Union and China eventually 2 years later. Eisenhower, when he got these letters from Khrushchev, he ignored them. He didn't even answer them because he knew he wasn't going to use nuclear weapons by 1957. He learned in 1955, oh, this crisis is over. So in 1957, when Khrushchev was writing the letters, Eisenhower didn't care. Eisenhower realized the problem wasn't Mao. Mao is not my problem. The problem is Chiang Kai-shek. He's causing this problem by putting all these troops on this tiny island. And this time, he sent Dulles to talk to Chiang Kai-shek and told him, stop talking about reconquering China. It's not going to happen. We're not going to help you. You can't do it. Shut up. And Chiang Kai-shek agreed. He shut up. He gave a big speech. And he said, I'm going to build free China on Taiwan. And that was it. The crisis was over. And the nuclear war did not happen. That's the real history. But that's not what people today think. People today think Eisenhower threatened to use nuclear weapons, and so the Chinese gave up. This is what most foreign policy experts in the United States believe today, still. And these are very good historians, but they've missed so much of the story because they don't read or speak Russian, and they don't read or speak Chinese, and so they can't read what the Russians and the Chinese were telling each other. They don't know the full picture of the history. Finally, I have one more part to the talk today before questions. What do we do? What do we do? This belief about threatening China with nuclear weapons, we can see from history, is not true. Abe and Trump's strategy will not work. China will not back down when you threaten them. So how can we get rid of this? What should we do to respond to this? And I have a few personal observations. I think we need to talk about the humanitarian aspects of nuclear weapons still. It's immoral to threaten to use these weapons. It's wrong. Japan should not support it. The United States should not do it. But I also think we need to teach people this history so that they know that these ways they think about things are more complicated. And it's not a simple matter of nuclear deterrence doesn't work the way they think it works. We need a public debate about that. And I think in the history of these two threats in Korea and Taiwan, we have evidence, real evidence, that this strategy that Trump and Abe want to use, it won't work against China. It won't work. But sadly, most of the leading NGOs and think tanks, they're not going to help us win this argument. No matter how much evidence you give them, no matter how many details or how many facts, they're going to still believe that nuclear weapons prevent war. It's almost impossible to change their mind. And I'll tell you why I think this. I'd like to share a personal experience. And this took place during a conference in 2015. It's a Carnegie Conference for Nuclear Policies. These are all the peace people in the United States, the experts in the peace, the left, the so-called left in the United States. And they have this conference, and they have it every year. It's the largest single gathering of disarmament and anti-nuclear people in the United States among the elite. And this one happened towards the end of Obama's second term as president. And quite a few individuals who spoke there were members of Obama's government. And one of them was this woman, Rose Gottmuller, who is Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Arms Control and Verification and Compliance. And then she was the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. She'd been working for Obama for 7 years. Top disarmament official. And prior to that, she had worked at Carnegie as the director of their Moscow Center. And a couple members of the audience asked her why Obama hadn't gotten the Senate to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty so that the United States would promise forever never to test nuclear weapons again. And here's how she defended the administration. Obama promised to do that during the campaign in 2008, and he did nothing. Nothing, not a word, not a statement, not a speech, nothing. And we asked him, somebody asked him about it at the conference, and here's how she defended herself. I think we need grassroots effort now to train and develop the support we need among the public, and then we can come back to the Senate. Because in 1999, when we lost the vote, 85% of the public supported the treaty, but today they don't remember what it is. She blamed you. She blamed me for not knowing enough. I was furious that she would do that. We know from polling data in the United States They did a poll in 2012. 84% of the public still approves of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So either she didn't know or she was lying. And the Obama administration didn't encourage grassroots anything. Not a word from them. So this is the first thing. Later in that same conference, there was a discussion of the humanitarian consequences of using nuclear weapons. And during that talk, they conducted a poll of the audience, and they asked them this question: could the use of nuclear weapons ever be justified? And 43% of the most liberal, left-leaning, pro-disarmament people in the United States said yes. They said yes. And that's when I decided that these people are never, never going to help us get rid of nuclear weapons. We got to do this from the bottom up. It's not going to happen from the top down. We've got to be stronger and put political pressure. You've got to pressure your government. I've got to pressure mine to make changes. And maybe if we can do that, we'll force these people to do their jobs and start negotiating how to get rid of these weapons, which is what they're supposed to do. They know all the science, they know all the technology, they know how we can take these things apart and safely put them away, how we can verify that the Russians are doing it, the Chinese are, they know all this. They know how to do it. We know how to do it. It's not a scientific or technical problem. It's a political problem. We need pressure from the bottom to force them to act. And with that, I'll end my talk and open it up to questions from the audience. Thank you.